Hey there, this is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru, and we are preparing to launch episode, or rather I should say season 3 of the Games Mastery series here on Just in Time Productions. Today's episode is going to be called Beginning the Begin. One of the greatest challenges to putting together a game session is working out the details of precisely what... Hang on a second. And we're getting closer here. Seems like we always get a little hitch and I get along here at the beginning of the season and of the episodes. And today is no different. As I said, I am Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru, and we are into the 3rd season of the Games Mastery series. And in particular today, we are going to talk about beginning the begin. How do you bring yourself to starting the very first game session from scratch? So the first question you have to ask yourself, and I'm asking you directly, is why become a game master? What is it that has drawn you to want to start this process? This highly fulfilling and yet sometimes frustrating world. Why even begin it? Well, the first reason, one of the more prominent reasons to become a game master, is that you are fundamentally a budding author. You have a story to tell, a book to write, a message to share with the world, and you want to test the waters with that material. So it's a logical advanced step towards producing a book or a resource material. But it's not perhaps directly related to the actual process of writing, because most of the performance of a role-play game storyteller or game master is done real time with other players. So arguably, unless you're actively recording sessions, you may or may not be able to get that information onto paper. There are tools and methods to accomplish this, and in future episodes we will actually go into the actual process of how to become a writer, how to move from being a storyteller in the direct way like role-play games and into the indirect methodology of being a writer. A second reason to become a game master is for feedback, of affirmation, and fulfillment. What I'm referring to here is that when you are creating a concept in a world that you want to engage people with, you start with wanting to make sure that your ideas make sense, that somebody else would find them interesting. Ultimately, the affirmation has more to do with your ability to communicate and convey information, and you're looking for the player feedback to let you know that that is meeting the mark. And ultimately, the very process of being a storyteller has a gratification factor. When you create a story and players respond to that story in a positive way and arguably make it their own by driving their characters into the story wholeheartedly, that's a real affirmation and fulfillment of your objectives, and it flat out feels good. So that's the second reason. A third, fourth reason. I gotta look at my notes. A fourth reason is perhaps a little less direct in-game, but perhaps more metagame, is a quest for power. A person who has played role-play games and noted that his portion of the story doesn't get the full attention he would expect, or has more details that he wants to include that he seems to not be able to. The very seat of power of being a dungeon master itself does give the player, the participant, who is the storyteller, a feeling of power. The life or death of the characters depend on his actions, his monsters, and so on. I have not found this to be particularly useful in my own life, but I have, to be honest, moments wherein the power of the seat does afford a modicum of control when other parts of life perhaps aren't as forgiving. Ultimately, being a storyteller opens up your opportunities to find your voice. Of course, clearly it means your ability to communicate through words, but it also is reflective of your ability to adjust and alter the direction of a conversation and to press the story forward in a way that is uniquely yours. And finding that voice actually can help out in all the different facets of your life, because being able to put to words the thoughts you have in your head is a powerful tool. And the lifetime I've spent behind the shield has definitely helped me to be able to convey information not only in small groups but on larger groups. There are even some of you perhaps who want to become a game master to make a difference. For example, in an area where the role-play game environment is lackluster or there's not a lot of enthusiasm, perhaps your way of telling a story, your ability to convey information, might make a difference in your play community. I do know that certain game masters, that once they come online in the game system, they make a difference radically because players are enthusiastic about the vision that player has of the very environment of the game you're playing. For example, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons is a fairly good match for the Nikos environment, although I'm finding out time over time that it's less effective that way. And yet I do see that there are players who have been responding very favorably to a more sensationalized role-play environment, such as Rio Ortiz's Battledrome methodology. Ultimately, though, it comes down to, and it really is this one issue, the Everest agenda. The mountain climber George, now I can't remember his name, I just had it on top of my head, Mallory, who unfortunately died in his quest to climb Everest, the second time, I believe, was asked why he wanted to climb the mountain, and he responded quite succinctly, because it's there. And some players of role-play games just simply think they need to sit in the seat of a game master at least once so they can say they'd accomplished it, that they had been in that role. And so it may not be optimal, but it does definitely fit the description of a purpose for becoming a game master. Okay, so let's assume we've gone to this point and you've decided you are going to become a game master. Well, the next thing we have to look at is what kinds of mechanics and what kinds of methodologies will draw players to your event, because just simply making the decision to become a game master doesn't automatically plunk people's butts in the seats, so to speak. So let's talk about what kinds of things will appeal to a player and bring them to your table. Well, the first one is schedule and availability. If you simply said, well, I'm going to run all of my games at 3:15 in the morning on Tuesdays, unrelentingly, and that's the only time I'm going to run it, well, you may get a player, but you're not going to get the kind of consistent on-time experience that you would like. So choosing to get feedback from the players even before you begin, so to speak, before you've even set up the first date and time of a session, find out where your players are and what their time constraints are. For example, I just recently had a condition where my players advised me that due to their school days, they won't be able to play on the regularly scheduled events we've been hosting over time. And that availability does cause a reduction in the number of players if that point in time and schedule is not accommodating to them. So finding a date and a time for your event before you even schedule it, before you even announce it, is probably optimal. The next thing to think about is players are going to want to play in a game that they find relatively easy to play and of which they are familiar. Hosting a Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition standard adventure league type of event is fairly easy because you are appealing to a growing number of players in the place where they are most familiar and are at greatest ease, especially if you are beginning that event or setting that event up to play to tier 1, the broadest range of new players possible. The next thing that you need to have to draw players is points of appeal and of intrigue. There is nothing, as P.T. Barnum would say, that drives attendance like controversy. Now, you don't clearly want that controversy to be truly controversial, because that may put your event in danger of not being able to be held, but instead find ways to intrigue your players and interest them in what you're doing. Leave a lot of open questions in your descriptions. Leave room for the players to draw their own conclusions about where the story might go, and therefore appeal to their interest in the game at a purely basic level. Ultimately, well, I keep using the word ultimately. I've got to learn to remove that word from my vocabulary until the end. Get it? Developing a sense of community and inclusion is important as well. So when you do decide to make your announcement of your event, make sure you make all players in all of the possible communities surrounding your play environment are aware of it, and make sure that you allow for inclusion of both new players and veterans, and draw attention to it from all levels, because at least initially you want players to come to the table to see what it's about. And while you may have some that will drop out, your succinctness in your message about the community and how well you're going to include everybody will draw more names rather than less, more people to your event. Another thing that players find appealing are the opportunities for advancement and their ability to adjust, modify, or impact the world. Whether this is you providing them with clear milestones that they can accomplish within game, or on a broader scope, just mentioning that they can become forces to be reckoned with in the world. This gives them the possibility and the willingness to advance and to actively impact the situation. Of course, if the game's environment you play is too serious and too wound up and there's no fun to it, or you're playing a scenario that is going to leave them with strong feelings of unfulfillment or futility, you'll find challenge. So make sure your games are fun and fulfilling as well, and transfer as much of this excitement in your announcement of your event early on to draw as many people as possible. Of course, the one of the keys that you need to remember is that there is an allure to the unknown. So while it might seem optimal to mention that your villain is himself a dragon, perhaps in order to draw players, you may want to only hint at that, because if they know who the enemy is at the beginning, they may say, oh, well, I've already fought dragons. That's not something I want to do, or whatever. So the trick is that this allure of the unknown is the whole card. It's the piece that you want to leave out of the story that will draw the players to engage. For a moment now, I want to change gears and talk a little bit about the relevance of a game. One of the biggest, I use this phrase a lot, a great challenge in role play, especially in a very active play community, is the relevance of the game. And by this, I mean, what is making your particular game unique, strategic, and compelling? If you don't have a unique selling position, if you don't have a anchor of interest that will draw players into your story, you will have a more difficult time getting players event over event. So in looking at it, you need to also look at the player demands. What is it they're looking for? I recently started, for example, a Call of Cthulhu game, and soon there were 4 or 5 people also running Cthulhu games in the store community where I am, and the number of players that were interested in running in my own Cthulhu game dwindled. So that indicated to me that I wasn't meeting the players' demands, and I wasn't reaching them where they were. So when you're building your event and you're creating the beginning of your story, you have to make sure that you're drawing upon a level of relevance and interest that already exists, or else you'll find yourself swimming upstream, so to speak. This also means that your event entrance threshold needs to be low. And what I'm referring to in this case is how much work will the player have to do to come to an understanding of the environment you're wanting to role play in. So, for example, again, Call of Cthulhu, if people aren't familiar with Lovecraft, aren't familiar with the dark nature of his humor and his strident visions into the unknown, you may have a difficult threshold point to reach. From that point, hey, John, how's it going? From that entrance threshold, you also have to look at what is the ramp quotient. And this is perhaps a bit more arcane, but it's the amount of information the players will have to advance themselves on in order to keep up with the story. Again, if you're looking at Cthulhu as an example, those that know it's a scary story are far more plentiful than those that understand that it's psychological, gothic, and horror related in terms of genre. So having a high ramp quotient can also drive players to be more reticent about becoming involved. Now, beyond all these things, we have to also be a little bit honest about ourselves. What is our relevance? And this is perhaps the hardest pill to swallow. We have to look at the standpoint of what is our own personal familiarity. How well are people aware of who we are as a storyteller? How fun have we made experiences in the past, and how compelling a story do we tell so that we can draw others in? How open and friendly are we as a storyteller? If we're wanting them to be a part of what we're doing, we certainly want them to feel comfortable with us. And then ultimately, how confident will the players be that we can reach the high objectives of a game in that environment? What is our facility to accomplish what we've set out to do? I know a lot of players who have great experience with high fantasy, but don't have much to do with gothic horror and such, and yet they feel compelled to try to run, say, the Ravensloft campaign or other Cthulhu-esque materials within the Dungeons and Dragons idiom. And one of the greatest challenges is that, it can be you can be as compelling a storyteller as possible. Your ability to convey the game in a fun environment may be great. You may even be familiar with the information, but if you don't have the capacity to convey that information in a way that the players also are feeling comfortable with their learning curve, you can end up with a game that's going to go off the rails relatively quickly. Another point of an event's relevance really is how malleable is the reality that you have the players involved with. What this refers to more than anything is that if the players themselves are showing signs that they are itching for a fight, that they're wanting to be engaged with basically a rolling dice off, they want to engage the enemy in physical combat, you have to be ready to change your story to afford that good fight in the middle of everything else in a way that won't destroy your overall story arc and yet allow the players to get what they're looking for out of the game. I can't tell you how many times I've set up in the early parts of a session thinking that we're going to go into some deep interpersonal role play and that we're going to dive into some of the purpose for the adventure and things like that, and yet found myself in a room full of players that were just ready for hack and slash. So you've got to be able to adapt your reality, and the players have to know that your reality is going to be adaptable to where they want to go so that they feel their control on the environment. Finally, in something like this, you have to look at what are your hard stops. Now, that term comes from my time in the military. There are devices, little engines that are used inside of equipment that are called a gimbal, and the gimbal move along a range of locations, say moving an antenna's face from one side to the other. And the gimbal that moves that, if it kept going, would eventually hit a point where the gearing of the gimbal wouldn't allow it to move any further, and instead it would jam up the engine. So you mechanically have to put a device in there, a little spring-loaded trigger called a hard stop, so that the gimbal won't go beyond its limits. In your game, if you are, for example, playing a Cthulhu type game and you've got this great role-play environment set up, and the players immediately start to physical fight with characters that you felt were critical to the story, you have to have some form of hard stop built into the creation of your game environment so that they won't run it off the rails, so that the fight will be interrupted in such a way to keep the players looking beyond and keep the NPCs relevant to the story so that they're no longer considered cast-offs. So by holding on to your hard stops, building a malleable reality, lowering the threshold, increasing the familiarity and the fun of the environment, and meeting what the players are looking for in your game, you'll already set up, even before you begin, a game that people really want to be a part of. Pardon me for a second. Need a little fluid in here. All right. What does this mean? This means that we as game masters, before we launch, have to be able to tell the short story. The short story actually is, you would, in a lot of different terms, that piece of information that a player needs to make the decision on whether or not he wants to participate. In essence, what is the heart of the matter? If your campaign, for example, is the expunging of a humanoid species that's interfering with commerce, that's what you say. We are. This scenario is a campaign to clear the hobgoblins out of Hillbilly Hollow for whatever reason. By having a short story like this, you make it easy for your players to grasp, to understand, comprehend where you're going. This ease with which they grasp it also gives them the opportunity to see how they would mold it or manipulate it to become the story that they want to be a part of. I call this getting them to get it. So if your short story transfers the meaning in a compelling way in a short message, it can have them getting it at the get-go. Right out the box, you can already be on your path towards a enjoyable and thrilling adventure. When you do this properly, therefore, even before the game goes, before it actually sets up and runs, you can actually convert your players or your potential players into promoters, as they will pass the word to their friends about the event and share their own enthusiasm and interest in the property, so that they want to be a part of it and therefore bring their friends as well. There are phrases in today's commerce world that apply. There's the elevator pitch and the business card. When you are going to run an adventure at a game store or at your home and you're wanting to get the word out, you have to have a way to draw players through communication. So something along the lines of, hey, Tuesdays, we're going to be trying to stop or prevent a war. Are you interested in helping me do so? That's a great little elevator pitch. Or something along the lines of, hey, Tuesday is the battle for Neo Moria. Don't you want to know why the Pony Empress is in hiding? These kinds of open questions, these kinds of little business cardy kind of comments draw players to want to learn more, and thereby draw interest to your event and perhaps bring their butts into your seats. Now, in doing so, you also want to think not only inside the box, setting a clear schedule and posting it on your local stores, websites and such, but you want to think beyond the sphere. Coming to the store, seeing people play other games and mentioning, hey, that game reminds me of the conflict. Oh, that's a war game? Yeah, there's a war going on in Neo Moria right now on Tuesdays. I think your ability as a strategist could be greatly appreciated. Can you make it on Tuesday at 6 p.m.? The game only runs 3 hours, but we definitely could use your assistance. You create a outside the box, a beyond the sphere mentality. By doing so, you give the players an opportunity, therefore, to range wildly with what that conflict might be. If they don't know much about the war, you've already built in questions and made them want to know more, and therefore give yourself advantages of opportunity. In other words, it's sometimes difficult to self-promote because you're having to announce things and draw, and pontificate, but by putting into their minds questions that they therefore want to ask. Oh, there's a war. What's going on? What do you mean by war? Are we talking, full scale planetary? Or are we talking, two tribes skirmishing with one another? These kinds of content questions lead us therefore to being able to develop something that the media calls the compelling content. And when it comes to selling property and turning your game into an environment where you could draw revenue from it, you do have to have compelling content. Well, what kinds of things go into creating compelling content? First of all, visuality and visualism. They sound like sort of the same thing, but creating a world that people can see in their mind's eye is creating visuality. Putting out there word pictures that they can see in action are visualisms. You're able to bring them into the story so that they're actually standing there watching the action. Compelling content is made up of strong visuality and great visualism. When you think about what you're going to be telling as a story, think about the vocabulary you will use when talking about it that will draw this intent. So, for example, if I said, are you interested in the war on Tuesdays? Somebody says, well, what's that about? I say, well, we have a situation where stridently racist organizations are starting to make moves against their perceived opponents. And those opponents are us, the common man. Now you've got interest because the players are going to want to defend themselves against such villainy. Now, the second thing about compelling content is it needs to have both digestibility and direction. In other words, if there is a war, there must be an agenda. There must be some reason why the war is occurring. the players have to have ways of determining what that is so they can decide whether or not they should be for or against the aggressor and decide which side of the war they're going to fall onto. By creating an environment, a conflict, a challenge that the players can literally get behind or get into, you definitely are building towards what's called compelling content. Of course, another key to this is to make sure that you leave what I call tickling uncertainty. If it's clear and overt who the bad guys are, it doesn't take long to realize that they need to be put down. Unless, of course, you've created some form of uncertainty that suggests that maybe the purpose for their aggression is somehow well-founded. And this leads to what I call leaving open loops. And this is actually once you get started. So the rest of this has been leading up to your first session, but now as you lead into that first session, you need to have ways to draw the players in. And so creating open loops and drawing the players into them one by one, and then closing them literally like doors behind them and drawing them into the event, you're giving yourself the opportunity for that player to not only experience what you're doing, but to see why they need to continue week over week. Of course, when you're doing this in a pre-event time frame, your messages need to be short. You don't need to be explaining how the Primus got to be there and what their vessels look like and all of that. You just simply want to talk about the conflict itself that's going on and the horrid nature with which 50% of the buildings and 25% of the population was obliterated in the first wave attacks. It's really horrible. You need to be involved to help us stop this. So brevity really is the soul of wit. You want to draw them in, but you don't want to, literally want to leave them hanging on your words so they'll come and be a part of what you're doing. Remember, it's more of what you didn't say than what you did say. So saying elves and racist automatically puts into mind, what are we talking about here? Is this race? Is this elf versus elf? Is this, elves versus dwarves? What do you mean by racism? What is the agenda behind your story? And it's what you didn't say that matters, because what you want left hanging in their mind is the unanswered question, because that's what will drive them crazy and drive them to your game. If they don't understand what's going on fully and they only have a taste for it, they're going to want to come and be a part of it just to get an answer to those unanswered questions. Now, I'm going to step back a bit and we're going to go back to the very concept we were talking about, which is beginning your event. And one of the biggest challenges is to look at, what are we speaking of? Is it a single event? Is it a series? Or is it a full-on ongoing campaign? I've categorized these into 7 different types, and some of them are a little flip-floppy, so don't feel that this is any kind of priority list in any way. But the special event, the one-shot, I'm going to do this one really cool thing, is important to set up and schedule well in advance. And you have to make sure that everyone's aware of it. One of the greatest challenges that we ran into recently is that we tried to set up and promote a special event with literally 8 days left until its actual inception. You want at least 30 days generally to start your marketing and promotion of an event. You don't want to say, hey, next Saturday I'm going to do blah, blah, and really expect anybody to show up, because that's short of a window. They don't even have enough time to compare it with what they're already doing to see whether or not there's even an opening. And so a lot of people just simply shut it out because it's too short. So give yourself some time on a special event. Also, your special event should be focused marketing-wise on the people that you know would want to be a part of it, because they will become the drivers. One of the things that I'm now starting to work on for the future is going to be a campaign-based play by email version of Twilight Imperium by Fantasy Flight. Mainly because it's got enough different teams and factions that we can start to build real interest in the story over time.
but it's going to be a special event in nature because it will culminate with an actual game of Twilight Imperium after the play-by-email game is complete. But anyway, the second type of event, I'm getting off subject when Stephen talked about that, so I apologize. Self-promotion, it's a dangerous business. Beyond the special event, you can have short notice improvs, and this happens when your regular game master doesn't show up and somebody needs to run the story. The short notice improvs are just the opposite. They have players coming, there's going to be players, but now you have to sell them on playing something other than what they originally intended. There's some keys to this that we'll talk about during the series when we come back to this episode in particular that will make it easier and more effective on keeping players in the game. More common are the planned series events, and that's where you say, well, we're going to run the Tomb of Annihilation as Adventure League. That's a planned series, and it has a stated beginning time, and generally you have a stated end time. In this case, Adventure League did not have a closing time, but we anticipate they have to be done before the end of December because the new season's supposed to start in January. So that's an example of a planned series. A planned series is not too different from a closed loop, and then a closed loop is actually a game series that can be replayed from its inception with new characters, but that the story elements don't change. Session over session, week over week, month over month. A more innovative methodology is to have an open loop, and that is a story that at its conclusion resets to the beginning with changes. There's things that have been shifted or adapted based on the outcome of the previous loop. More common in role-play games, though, you either have a true railroad where the game master is driving things down the path they want, or more likely they've chosen and sculpted a directed driver. But what I mean by that is a story that is being driven as a railroad can be difficult to get players to be involved with if they think they're being dragged through it by the nose. On the other hand, if the GM has picked out and groomed a directed driver to the story, and that driver gets the direction that the story is going in, then it's not the GM who's driving it, it's the players, and therefore it feels more homogenous, more open to options. Ultimately, the largest, and here we go with that ultimately again, but that's ultimately, in this case, it literally is the last point of this section, are the sandbox games, and this is where the boundaries are drawn only as limits to physicality, not to the course and direction of the players. And while many argue that the sandbox is a compelling play environment, what I have found is that it ends up degenerating into either a player versus player or player versus environment campaign where they're simply trying to break the stuff that was written, trying to derail it and shift it. Now, we've talked about all of this, and this is all about beginning of individual games and campaigns, but I want to take a few minutes here at the end of this video to talk about the transition of a different kind, the beginning of a different kind, and that is trying to begin an environment where you're a professional game master, where you're actually able to draw revenue from your experience and your skill. The first thing that's necessary to make this beginning, this new transition to an income-based role-play games environment, is an essential objectivism. You have to understand and believe the value of what you do is strong enough to justify the revenue. Because if you can't believe it or don't hold on to that concept, others certainly will not. There also has to be an air of environmental opportunism. There has to be a way for you to build new players who can be introduced to your style in such a way that they are willing to pay the dollars and are willing to bring the game into existence. What this will lead to, therefore, is the development of a fan base, and sometimes the easiest is to put the egg before the chicken and play and be a storyteller until you have a considerable fan base to draw against, and then have them become your payers. But the point is then, who are the payers and what are they paying for? In the case of my own world, I am embarking on a pathway to create a Patreon for Nykos, so that people who are advocates of the story can at once support what we're doing and build a future for the property to become the books and video game properties and such that it could be, while allowing them and affording them an opportunity to be a part of the action. So you really have to think, when you're going into the professional side, who's going to be paying and what are they going to be paying for? By far the strongest of these fans are the ones who would be willing to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, who see the future of the property and are willing to become patrons and ideologues. And what I mean in those terms is they are the ones that want to be a part of it, want to put their effort into making a reality out of the game world and such. And at this point, I'm wanting to build for Nykos and for the Game Masters Academy that key group of patrons and ideologues. And I have several people who are have already made statements to that positive effect. And in the near future, you'll get to meet some of those through the Patreon website and such. But this transfer to a professional environment necessarily has to have your own dedication to the process, which brings us to what sacrifice. What is it you're willing to do to make your world an income generator? So in this case, the sacrifice is not only one of the number of hours that I'm endeavoring to work on this project, but it's also the sacrifice of other income sources and such. I fundamentally moved away from the salary positions that I've worked in the past to give this a shot, but I've also sacrificed a lot in terms of other projects that I might have been a part of in the past that I simply have had to set to the shelf so that this will happen. So over the next few months, as we move into season 3 of the Academy and the launch of, or the hard launch of the Game Masters Academy in January, we're going to be talking about that. And this, of course, leads itself with the concept of what sacrifice to a realization and an acceptance and a willingness to be transparent going forward. And so therefore, it's clearly a measure of the valuation of the property, figuring out what people are willing to put into the pie to make it work, and vindication of us once it gets to the launch process. With this, we've come to the end of this episode of the Game Masters Academy. This is episode 1 of season 3, and I want to thank you for your participation, and feel free to feedback to me through direct messages or visit my website, www.thegamemarketguru.com. And I hope to hear from you soon. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Market Guru, for the Game Mastery Academy on Just in Time Productions.